If I say the word wildlife to you, do you have a good feeling, a bad feeling, and what does it mean to you?
That's why I'm here. I've always done wildlife since I grew up on the Chobe. So my dad started Chobe National Park, and I grew up running around on the banks of the river when I was 3, and that's when I wanted to work in wildlife. So I've never had any, my whole life been about wildlife.
So, how does it make you feel?
It make me feel. I guess when I went to, like, you go in a national park like we did yesterday, and you just feel all the cares of the world go off your shoulder. I love wildlife. I can sit there for hours. If there's no wildlife and I'm sitting in a park, that's also okay. It's just natural areas like that. They get to your soul and they let you relax and disconnect or reconnect maybe. Yeah, I think my whole life is about wildlife and rural people actually.
Yeah. And why do you think there's a growing wildlife economy? You know, it seems to be an exponential, cumulative, collective. You know, we were here in Kaza, and that's quite a monumental project in the sense that it wasn't politics which brought people together, it wasn't trade of goods which brought these countries together, it wasn't movement of people which brought these together. The focus of the thing was a conservation effort which will bring all those things under the umbrella. So it's very interesting to me, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding, but it was actually conservation, and then within that is wildlife, because they need big bloody areas. So, I mean, how come we've got this growth?
Yeah.
What's happening?
So I think cars is actually very late to the party. I think we started
So
this.
for our people viewers who don't know, can we call it the Kavango
Oh yeah,
Zambezi
okay.
Transfrontier, and then later?
And they because I won't be hearing your questions.
Probably not.
Yeah. Just ask that again quickly.
Yeah, why did Kaza happen, and why is there just this? It's almost like everybody's jumping in now and recognizing that wildlife can be the catalyst for many changes. And I'm wondering why this is happening.
Yeah. So my father went to school at Plumtree School, where I went to school, with 4 other guys, including Alan Savory, and their passion was to bring wildlife back because they thought that wildlife was natural in Africa, and it was being pushed out by cattle. And in fact, as you look back, essentially what we've had is Western systems dominating Africa, and with Westerners they've pushed agriculture and cattle into every corner of the continent. And these guys look back and said, why is this exotic monoculture imported from somewhere else a better land use? And they looked and they said, we've got the spectacular wildlife. Why isn't wildlife doing better than livestock economically and on farms? And their first judgment was that the reason was that farmers didn't own wildlife. So people like my father in the 60s. Well, actually, he had another story. He was working with the Bushmen just across the road here, and he was sampling whatever springbok on a pan at night, and they caught this Bushman, so-called poaching, and my father interrogated the Bushman, and which meant he sat down with a cup of tea and asked him what the hell was going on, and he sort of gave the Bushman this paternalistic lecture. We're looking after wildlife for the people, for development of the country. And the Bushman turned on my father and said, who the hell do you think you are? We've been living with Bushmen, with wildlife for thousands of years. There's plenty of wildlife. If the money goes to Gaborone, because it was in Botswana, it doesn't benefit us. If they build a school in Lobatse, it doesn't benefit us. This is our wildlife. And my father said he had a paradigm shift at that moment, and he was basically set up the wildlife agencies in Botswana and Zimbabwe, and we had this old-fashioned Western top-down law of a wildlife department. All the local people were poachers, and he changed that, and he realized that until people owned wildlife, it wouldn't come back. And so he wrote starting in the 60s they changed the law, and then they wrote a major law in Zimbabwe, 1975 Parks and Wildlife Act, that gave farmers the ownership of wildlife. Now, I was a government extension officer starting in about 1984, And my job was to go from ranch to ranch. These are the big white farmers, 10,000 hectares, cattle farmers. And I went from cattle farm to cattle farm to cattle farm. And number one, these guys were struggling financially. Number two, because they were struggling financially, their wildlife, their cattle population, they're pushing the stocking rate. Because if I have 1,000 cattle, I can make a bit more money, but my environment crashes. And in the 1984 drought, everything crashed. Everybody went, only 5% of cattle farmers were viable. So at that stage, they started doing hunting. So they had the cattle had squeezed out all the grazing species. So the sable and the Liechtenstein's hartebeest and the zebra were very low numbers, were gone. But because of the bush encroachment created by the cattle, you still had things like a few bushbuck and a few kudu and maybe some eland, which are quite high value species. So the farmers started hunting these animals, and they kind of realized, yes, we're making quite a lot of money out of them. And then along came me, and I actually did the sums. I worked with the farmers and got their numbers, and we looked at cattle, and cattle were earning, I can't remember what it was, 7 cents per kilogram, and wildlife were earning 20 cents per kilogram. And so I went to all these field days and I showed them this, and the farmers said, well, if we switch from 1 kg of cow to 1 kg of wildlife, our profits go up 16 or 7, whatever, however many cents it was. And over the next 6 years, about in Zimbabwe, where there's only 4,000 commercial farmers, I would say about 500 to 1,000 switched, or they really increased wildlife in their businesses. And the way they did that was through hunting. Hunting allowed them to move from basically overgrazed livestock ranches that were going bankrupt back into wildlife, to reduce the stocking rate, because they could make 3 or 4 times as much money from wildlife as they could from livestock. So they could reduce the stocking rate and also shift the stocking rate from being just one species noshing all the grass and destroying the environment to giraffe and kudus and impala and and a multi-spectrum species, which is better for the environment, and their profits went up. So we weren't promoting wildlife because we do love wildlife, but we weren't promoting it because of wildlife. We were promoting it to save the farmers from ecological and economic bankruptcy. And sure enough, there's a major shift in land use. And Zimbabwe then went through this land disaster run by Mugabe. But before that, in sort of the end of the white regime, about 10,000 hectare ranches had shifted to wildlife. So you're in a scope where all the land initially developed for cattle was now being completely rewilded back to wildlife. And hunting enabled that to happen, because when you hunt, you actually shoot a very small number of animals. So if you've got 100 animals, you can only hunt 2. And you have to manage, unlike cattle, where when you harvest cattle, you're harvesting on grassland about 3.5 years, so you never get any old animals. With wildlife, you have to manage the whole spectrum, not only the whole spectrum of species, but the whole spectrum of age. So you have to put back a natural system, and you just pick off 2% of the top, and that makes you 4 times as much money as cattle. And wildlife has got this hunting has got a couple of superpowers. Number one, if you've got a herd of kudu or eland or zebra or whatever, they are growing at 20% a year, but hunting takes off 2% of the year. So you're making a lot of money from 2%, while also allowing your wildlife to increase. So that is why hunting is such a critical tool for rewilding. Overseas, they're scared that hunting's going to somehow wipe out the animals. Well,
logically, it kind of makes sense if you just look through one lens, that
Yeah.
hunting kills wildlife. And a lot of these are on the species endangered, red list, and I'm not sure people are aware of the paradox that there's growing wildlife numbers. Do you understand? So
Yeah.
I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt on this one. I mean, you can disagree.
So this is when, in the moment, hunting reduces the wildlife by like 1%. But that's a very simple system. I've got 100 buffalo, I shoot one, there's 99. But if you think in systems, I've got 100 buffalo, I shoot 2. By the end of the year, they breed 20, I've got 118. Not only that, but I've made a bucket of money, and I now support the buffalo, or I buy a bit more land, and so now instead of after having one ranch, I'll have 2 ranches. So instead of 10,000 hectares, I have 20,000 hectares. Instead of 100 buffalo, I've got 500 buffalo. So hunting drives the economics of wildlife, so people have more and more and more. The other thing about hunting, if I overhunt, say buffalo, and coming, there's a pyramid, so buffalo 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and when they get to 8 or 10 years, they're big enough to hunt. If I hunt too many and I start selling babies, well, not babies, but so 7-year-old, I will get a reputation in this very transparent hunting market for overhunting, and people will shun me. And it's very hard once you've destroyed your reputation to get your reputation back. So if I'm over harvesting, which I wouldn't do anyway, why would I over harvest? If someone's making a lot of money out of cows, he doesn't remove his cows, he has more. If I'm making a lot of money out of buffalo, I have more, I don't have less. It's a weird Western perception. But once I owned the buffalo, when we started this, the urban people said, no, if you do hunting and you give the ownership of the wildlife back to the farmers, they're going to wipe it out. Well, that's not what happened. It was exactly the opposite. Because they owned it, it was valuable, it became the most important resource. In fact, wildlife is the new crop of Africa. It's Africa's most valuable resource. And by making it valuable, we have more and more and more. So our job in government, we only had to do 2 things. We gave the ownership of the wildlife to the farmers, and then we promoted the value. We hunt it, we photograph it, we trade it, and because the more valuable it is, the more we produce. It's just like iPhones. If the price of iPhones goes up, Apple's going to produce more. If the price of buffalo or kudu or elephant goes up, we're going to produce more. For some reason, conservation has got their supply and demand curves upside down. So they think if the price goes up, supply goes down, which is just, that maybe was what happened 150 years ago in the American West when they wiped out their bison. But then they had no institutions, they had no ownership. We've seen that problem, we fixed it. And they haven't seen we fixed it. And in fact, what you're looking at in Southern Africa is probably the biggest conservation success on the planet. It's the only place in the world where we're having substantial increases in wildlife. I think Namibia's gone from 500,000 to 1 million animals to something like 3 or 4. South Africa's gone from 500,000 animals. If you look at the history of South Africa, as the white farmers came on, they absolutely wiped out everything. They hunted it, they ate it, and in 1960, 70, there was no wildlife. Now there's somewhere between 6 and 10 million wild animals on farms. We're not talking about national parks here, we're talking about farms where people have to make land use choices. And you've got now maybe in South Africa 10 million animals outside the parks, and maybe if you're lucky 1 million or 500,000 inside the parks. And in Namibia, for example, we know there's 80% of the wildlife is outside the parks. And from my research, somewhere between 60 to 80% of the wildlife in the region is funded by hunting. And we don't think it should only be hunting. We don't fight, should you have hunting or should you have tourism? You want both. Because if you've got hunting and tourism, you make more money. And if wildlife makes more money, then you buy more land for wildlife and you have more. In the Western press, there's this sort of dichotomy between hunting and tourism. But we've done economic studies here in Namibia. The most profitable ranches do hunting and tourism. In fact, where we're sitting right here, we have a lodge, and behind us you can probably see floodplains. Well, 20 years ago, there was no wildlife here. Now, hunting came in, started to recover the wildlife. Then tourism came in and started to pay money. Well, the tourists got happy and spent a lot of money in Namibia, and the money started going back to communities. But just down the road, there's still a hunting camp. And the hunter comes in for maybe 30 days a year and has a certain quota of elephants, buffaloes, hippos, crocodiles, whatever. And although he only comes for 30 days and there's almost no impact, you can't notice his footprint on the land here, he is still paying as much money to the community as the lodges. The lodge, the value chains of hunting and tourism are very different. Tourism creates a lot of employment, but the margins of tourism are very tight, so it doesn't put a lot of money back into conservation. Hunting, so maybe of a lodge 5 to 8 in a good area like a lodge like this that's well managed, maximum 8% goes back to the community. In most lodges, maybe 3 or even 1% goes back into conservation or the community because they're struggling to survive. With hunting, about 30% goes back to the community because the margins are better. So if I'm clever, I have hunting and tourism because the hunting gives me the cash to manage the wildlife and the tourism employs my people. And it doesn't make that much money, but it's a business. And then if I'm really, one of the fallacies about this also is because you're doing hunting, your wildlife's going down. Well, it's not. The biggest problem on hunting farms is too many animals. Because as I said, you're taking 2%, they're growing at 20%. So each year you go 20%, you add 20% to your wildlife population. Before you know it, you're overstocked. And that destroys the environment, just like cattle do. So then you automatically have a meat production system. And the cattle take grass and they turn it into meat through 4 legs and a rumen. Wildlife takes grass, puts it through a rumen or a hindgut and turns it into meat, probably at almost the same rate as cattle, maybe a little lower. So when you're shifting to tourism and hunting, you're not actually losing much protein production. It's a bit harder to harvest, but I'm also thinking that maybe it's more healthy. So if you want to, we're talking about stopping eating meat on this planet because it's so bad, and that's true because you've got chickens and pigs and cows in these dreadful feedlot conditions and batteries. But if you're eating wild meat, you're pushing money back into having more wild animals. Just like if you buy anything, the industry expands. And further than that, particularly if you go in the rural communities, they have a great preference, including the Amazon and this part of the world. They much prefer wild meat because they think it's healthier than chicken grown in batteries with antibiotics and all sorts of stuff. And I've talked to communities and I say, yeah, no, we much prefer to hunt because if we eat chickens, we're going to get cancer. And that's probably true. So for me, the next revolution is a wild meat. We should be shifting to wild meat under sustainable conditions, not just sucking the system dry. But if people own the wildlife, including things like cane rats and whatever people eat in different parts or dikers, if they own it, they're going to look after it and they're going to produce it. The problem that we started with that creates a conservation problem is that under Western ideology, wildlife is owned by the king. So that started with old William the Conqueror. In 1066, he invaded from Normandy into England, and he dominated the English, and he took over the forests, and he set out the Doomsday Book, and the Doomsday Book was basically a tax register. So he took ownership of land and he taxed everything. But what people forget, he also took ownership of the wildlife. So he said that's a king's game. And poor old Robin Hood, if he existed, Robin Hood was probably much like a bushman or local person here. He was somebody running around the forest and his livelihood was wildlife and had been wildlife for thousands of years. And he was dominated by William the Conqueror, who now said your livelihood is illegal. The way you make your living is no longer legal. So Robin Hood then is criminalized, just as we've done with Africans. And then that dogma or that system then shifted into pretty much the United States, where as Westerners spread west across the US and settled it and settlement and wiped out the bison, they also wiped out the local people, and the wildlife disappeared. So they said, oh, we need to control this. So they made 2 measures that were short term maybe quite good by Roosevelt, who's was a good president, but in long term absolutely disastrous. Number 1, they said the wildlife is owned by the state. Well, no one looks after state resources. And number 2, you can't you take it out the market. I can't remember the act, the Dingle Act or something. And so they took wildlife out of the marketplace, so it had no value. And they took this system from the US through the London Convention of 1900 1933 with the European colonial powers, and they imposed it on Africa and other places, which said you don't own the wildlife and it has no value. So if you go and look up in the north of Africa now, or the way, what happened to elephants and rhinos and that, well, nobody owns them, so nobody's going to look after them. And so the state is the organization that exerts the ownership, that exerts the rights of exclusion. So under the British stroke, American stroke, European model, the state excludes you from the wildlife and protects it. Now when the state collapses or breaks down or doesn't have the capacity or prioritizes healthcare or HIV or something, then it's an open access resource. It's a tragedy of the commons. So what Western incursions into Africa basically shifted from a locally based management of wildlife to a very brief period of state-owned domination, which worked. And then when the state lost interest, it basically created a massive tragedy of the commons. So the loss of wildlife in Africa is a tragedy of the commons situation. For some reason, it's completely misinterpreted as a demand trade situation. If you trade with no property rights, well, of course it's going to disappear. It's a tragedy of the commons. If you trade with the local people owning wildlife, as we see right around here, they trade, they sell wildlife to hunters and tourists, they make money, there's more wildlife. And so the global conservation biologists seem to be a little bit incoherent in the way that they set up wildlife policy.
I don't know if these things, thank you, I don't know if these two things are linked, but I'm just trying to put myself in the footsteps of my people back in UK, in London. And I'm wondering if they have drastic kind of emotional, ethical, moral issues, you know, that they're not aware of the successes, they're not aware of the hunting contribution, and they simply, you know, people coming from Europe, they really do love safari. I'm not saying that Sussex flay in the dunes, but even there's oryx and springbok and beautiful birds. And so I was wondering if the one thing was this moral, ethical kind of, as you say, this kind of royal game, you know, don't touch it. And then the other one I'm thinking is the disconnect between what we do with other species and these monocultures, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and that's completely acceptable. And then you talk about elephants, ostrich, and it's completely unacceptable. It's just a knee-jerk, it's an emotional response. And that's how I feel. I'm just being honest with you. Is there any way you can try and explain that perhaps that's our response now in Europe to hunting and to banning trophy? With all the good intentions, they're not, I don't know, do you get what I'm trying to say? So there's this ethical, moral, and then there's this disconnect between the people, you know, I saw a survey recently, 90% of Americans eat meat. You know,
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm trying to say?
I get what you're trying to say. So I think we're facing a what do you call it? A social media backlash against hunting, and against trade in rhino and ivory and etc. etc. And it's very loud and it's very vociferous. So I have two analyses. One, when you talk to ordinary people, most of them understand. So I think we're talking about a very loud, very influential fringe element in the first place. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance here, and we also get very angry because what you've got is people sitting in urban areas that are relatively wealthy, who've basically wiped out all the wildlife on their land. And if you look at someone like Switzerland, the wolves are coming back and the people want to destroy them. And in Britain, they call farmland national parks. And those people who don't have resource and have a massive, massive carbon footprint on the planet have the gall and they to criticize us and see us as pariahs when we actually live with wildlife and we've put in a system which is different from theirs, and they probably don't like it because it's different from theirs. They can't understand it. And our system works and increases wildlife. And so for some stupid reason, we have a war in conservation between people who don't want to touch it, don't want to use it. And I think it's a control freak thing. Because I think conservation grew out of a control freak mentality where you have what I call the bio elite or the biotechnical elite. And they sit in offices and they say, no, we must tell everybody on the planet what to do. And the consequence of that is that 70 to 80% of wildlife has disappeared since 1970. But that doesn't change their feeling that we the clever guys, must be in charge. And so when we come in and we have a completely opposite model, a completely different way of doing things, it challenges the status quo. And when you change, often you just get people try and stomp on you. Well, we're not going to be stomped on. We spent so much time fighting in the House of Lords, in Belgium, in the US, to keep one of the only successes in conservation in the world alive, being hammered by people who claim to be conservationists, who have driven many species, who are part of a society that has driven many species to extinction, and are telling us what to do and trying to reimpose a model that's failed. And our only interpretation is they're creating a crisis and they're making a whole lot of money out of it. Because why else? What are their motivations if that? Why are they destroying wildlife? I mean, honestly, we really and really, truly struggle with that. And if anyone wants, come and visit us. We'll take them out and show them. Let them make their own decisions. But I actually, 2 weeks ago, one of my colleagues in the IUCN basically was very anti-hunting and promoting hunting bans. And I asked them, why don't you come out and see? I told them, I was working in a community in Botswana that was, they're making 60% of their livelihoods out of hunting. A bushman community, not a bushman, but a hunter-gathering community, a Yei community actually from here. And they made 60% of their livelihood out of wildlife. And 30% was essentially coming from outside. And that's way better than most communities which are really struggling. So the hunting ban took those people, and instead of being a growing community where the middle class had enough food to eat, the hunting ban threw them into destitution. And if you go and find them now, they're living in poverty, in destitution, on the edge of urban civilization, on the edge of urban towns. So some arrogant decision from far away says, oh, no, we can't hunt elephants. And then millions of elephants has taken rural people who've lived with wildlife for thousands of years, who have actually said, we're going to move, this Western agricultural model has failed. We're going to move back to a hunter-gathering land use model based on hunting and tourism and meat and such, and doing it successfully, get destroyed by Western ideology. I mean, for me, that really sucks. I'm still angry about that. That was 10 years ago.
Chief Mayunu was also
Yeah,
amazing.
because we're not doing this only for the wildlife. What we know is that. So if you take the big picture, going and a step back, we've taken a Western monoculture system, we've spread it into all areas of Africa, and it's failed. And what we're trying to say here is the wildlife model makes 4 times as much money. And we want to our goal is not wildlife conservation. Our goal is to uplift the poorest people in the world. And not only uplift them monetarily, but to manage wildlife, they've got to get organized, they've got to create democracy, they've got to manage stuff. So we're trying to, and really they're going back to the way they used to live, which was hunter-gathering, just in a modern format. So we're basically trying to rewild. We're trying to move from a domination of a few domestic species back to massive intact wild habitats and land and livelihoods based on those massive intact habitats which used to exist. And yet we get pushback. It's really hard to understand why people don't like what we're doing.
And when we look ahead, climate change is racing towards us. I can feel it. It's like a forest fire, How are we going to live in the future? What's the role of wildlife, and how You know, if people are so okay with livestock, livestock's fine, morally, ethically, environmentally, socially, politically, it's all cool. And wildlife's a pariah in some degrees, or at least the hunting aspect is a pariah. How are we going to survive in the future with climate change? What are the predictions? What's the general trend between, um, I'm going to call it kind of European style ranching and wildlife utilization? What's the trends? What's the future? What will work? What won't? Can you explain where we're going, where we've come from? What's the patterns?
Okay, so I think we're all familiar with climate change, and climate change is basically driven by massive Western consumption based on fossil fuels. And the irony of it, or the unfairness of it, is the West has developed on that, and we are sitting out here bearing the consequences. And in Namibia, Zimbabwe, Southern Africa, it's predicted we're actually going to have more consequences than anywhere else in the planet.
Sorry, what are the predictions?
So if you go to Western Namibia right now, they've had a drought for 10 years, and we worked with people there earlier in the year, and fundamentally they had no food. Their livestock was all dead. Then it was a disaster. They've gone from being viable wildlife stroke livestock people, because we're not saying wildlife versus livestock. Often people have both, particularly rural people, because livestock so cultural. But these was communities that were going, and now these are communities that are living on food aid. So the climate change is going to have it's having a massive impact on us. It's taking us from being able to grow maize, which if you can have 120 days of rain, you can grow long variety maize and get 10 tons per hectare. As climate change comes in, you can only grow 90-day maize, so your yield goes down, and I don't know if my figures are right, from 10 tons to 3 tons, and the area that you could grow maize gets smaller and smaller, so people that could feed themselves can't feed themselves. And in fact, we've been looking at agriculture in many of our marginal areas. Agriculture has become a cultural activity, not an economic activity, partly because of climate change, and partly because of the long-term decline in what we call terms of trade. So you used to be able to buy, a farmer used to be rich, but now the farmers are the hungriest people in the world. So these people are sitting out there on the margins in the marginal areas, trying to live on agriculture and failing, and at the same time, as poverty, destroying the environment. Mainly because they're adopting grain-based or livestock-based monocultures, which don't fit in complex environments. These are simple systems, and we have the most complex environment here. It rains one year, it doesn't rain, things move, we have migrations, people move. We've taken this very simple model, Western model, and we plonked it in the middle of African complexity, and it's just a disaster. If you put wildlife back, wildlife is adapted to that. And not only so wildlife is what we call a climate adaptation. We can continue, not as well, because obviously if it's dry our productivity is going to get down, but a whole lot better than a non-adapted system like livestock or crops. So we can adapt to climate change with wildlife if the West doesn't close our markets. Because what do we do if they close our hunting, close our ivory, close our rhino horn? I mean, we're throwing away, or not we're throwing away, the West has taken away our rights to sell well over $1 billion worth of animals. The whole land use transformation in Southern Africa has been driven by hunting, which is a $500 million industry. The rhino horn market now, with rhinos depleted, although they're increasing in our region, is worth $1 billion. Imagine how much wildlife.
In the black market.
Well, if it was a free market, if it was a trade.
So you've estimated the black market is worth.
Because when you harvest, I'll get back to your point. When you harvest a rhino, you don't kill it; you cut its horn off. That rhino is producing something like 25 to 50,000 US dollars a year of rhino horn, and you can harvest it 2 years or 3 years later, because a rhino produces a kilogram of horn a year. So that rhino is producing 50,000, and a cow's net revenue is $100. So a rhino doesn't weigh, whatever, 500 times more than a cow. So if we shift from cows to rhinos, we really increase our production. And putting $500,000 $500 million into farmers through wildlife has shifted 115,000 farmers from livestock to wildlife. And yet we've thrown away another $1 billion. If we put that $1 billion into the farmers, you'd probably see half of Southern Africa going back to like the Serengeti. We could take down the fences, we could link up the farms. We would be almost back to nature, which is what we're being told we must be. We must conserve 30%. If we had rhinos and elephants and hunting, we could turn half of this continent back to not 30%, but to 50%. So, and we'd have, what we're aiming for is we've got a $3 billion wildlife economy. There's no reason we couldn't have a $30 billion wildlife economy. And everyone shouts and says, you're commoditizing wildlife. Well, instead of having 10 million wild animals, we'll have 60 million wild animals. Instead of having 25% of our land under wildlife, we'll have 50% of our land under wildlife. So that's what people like us are doing. We're trying to create a wildlife economy because we can see climate change is coming. We can see that agriculture is not working. We can see that wildlife's under threat. And we can also see there's a damn good market there. If we had wildlife everywhere, we would be a major, major destination. And the bigger we get, the bigger we get. So people go where, if tourism is successful, more people go. And at the moment, we're basically focusing on rich Westerners. And we're getting a black middle class coming through in the cities, a black upper class. We still need to get those people into, there's a huge market there, an internal market. There's a whole Eastern market, so we haven't even started. And through economics, we could almost turn Africa back to what it used to look like. Not as a pretty thing locked away in a zoo for some Westerners to enjoy, but as a way of making our people richer. What was the question you asked?
No, I think it's fine. It was just a small point about the black market, and I think it's clear. And I can always put a little graphic under, just an explanatory thing. I still think we need to do a little bit about the ethic, moral, hunting process. I mean, or we just beating our head against the wall. There's no point talking about how we know what we're doing when it comes to the actual bullet, you know, and the fact that there's transparency, that there's traceability, we monitor our wildlife, we have local people involved, whether it's the farmer in title deed areas, freehold land, or whether it's game guards and conservancies, that there's this real love and respect for the wildlife we're killing. And how do we put
So the ethical thing is another issue that we struggle with. One is, Westerners are creating the biggest footprint on the planet, and we have a very light touch, and yet we're being punished. The second thing is this hatred of hunters. Now, I know a lot of hunters, and they might be called hunters, but essentially what they are is rather rural, rugged people that are damn good at what they do, and they'll get their farm or their ranch or their large area. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine manages 400,000 hectares of wild land. He doesn't like hunting. His objective is to bring that back to nature. He's a rugged guy. He can fix a Land Rover. He can track an animal. He can fight insurgents. He's a really tough and rugged, what you would think would be a heroic guy. And he spends his entire time working with the local people and protecting the wildlife. So then he looks at the wildlife and he says, well, I can't do this for free. No NGO is going to give me money because I am who I am. I'm a bit rugged, I'm a bit maybe redneck. He's not redneck, actually. But they look at him and say, no, we must give our money to the guy with a bow tie for some large organization. So he's sitting there and he's absolutely passionate about wildlife, and he's absolutely competent, and he's at home in the bush, and he'll walk 20 miles a day rather than go to a conference and drink cappuccino. And he sits there and says, well, how do I pay for my wildlife? And everyone talks that tourism is a wonderful thing. We should switch from hunting to tourism. But he's so far away. So I tried tourism. I even got a rich person to help me set up a lodge. Tourists didn't come because it's too expensive. They go to Kruger and Victoria Falls, that's it. So if we want to conserve Kruger and Vic Falls, tourism is great. But if we want to conserve a far wildlife area, tourism just doesn't work. It's not viable. Where you can do tourism, you make a lot of money, but that's maybe less than 5% of the land. So he sits there and says, what option do I have? His only option is hunting. So he says, so he hunts lions, doesn't hunt elephant. He hunts lions, he hunts leopards, he hunts buffalo, and that pays to conserve the area. And for me, that guy's a hero. He's more in tune with the environment than any of these people that are abusing him. He's grown up in the bush. He's doing it for livelihood. He's doing it because he loves the wildlife and he loves the people. Yet nobody sees him as a hero. And for me, I'm not saying there aren't some crazy rich people that come and entitled white fat men, because hunting's been branded as entitled white fat men coming to hunt animals. Yeah, there's a few people like that. But what hunting is really about is like this guy sitting there in a piece of land, and he will die to look after that land, but he needs a way to fund it. And in terms of his day, in terms of his year, he probably spends 320 days looking after wildlife, and then the hunt. Everyone thinks the hunt is trophy hunting is being abused, and the people that don't like us are branding hunting as trophy hunting. Well, we don't have trophy football and we don't have trophy rugby, so that's a brand. Hunting is very different things. So first of all, you have to spend years and years managing your wildlife properly, because otherwise you can't have hunting. Then when the client comes out, he has a hunt. A hunt is more like as we were talking last night, it's an odyssey. You come out, you have a camp, and you work really hard to hunt your animal. You might go 3-4 days, you look for an animal, it's hot, there's tsetse flies, you maybe get run over by an elephant. It's a very deep spiritual experience, being out there trying to survive in the bush. And then eventually you do shoot the animal, which personally I don't like. And at the end of it, it's like your climax, you have a pair of horns. That's not what it's about, but it's been branded. That's like the cup. When the South Africans, the whole thing wasn't about the cup at the end. It's not about the trophy at the end. It's about all the hard work going up to that. And then there's a cup. And that's been I think, very twisted in the Western media about hunting not being an adventure, being back in nature. So is it better to hunt your meat or your trophy and pay a lot of money for an experience like that, or sit and ignore on the side all the chickens that are being brutalized in their chicken factories? So Western people are living in, I feel like concentration camps for animals. And yet we're hunting animals at the end of their lives, and a very few of them. And the people that have concentration camps for animals have the gall to criticize what we're doing, when we're actually going back to how humans in some ways evolved. These are very difficult ethical questions. And then the other ethical question is taking livelihoods away from people. Like I told you with Sankuyu, people, they're hunter-gatherer peoples, they live on wildlife. And you sit in London and just say you can't have a livelihood. You're basically going back to old William the Conqueror and Robin Hood and saying your livelihoods are illegal. Is that ethical? I don't think that's ethical. And so we have a very, very narrow arrogant ethical perspective. Even sitting in London or Washington telling rural Africans what to do, is that ethical? We think that's really quite colonial and racist. So once we get into the ethical debate, it gets extremely tangled up. And Africans are getting really, the capacity of Africans to manage their wildlife is improving enormously. We saw that this week. We had these 30 Africans from all 10 or 10 countries, I think 8 countries, who are really dedicated to manage their wildlife. We went out in the communities, and here in the Namashasha area, they have elephants in their fields, they have lions scaring them. Yet you ask them, do you like wildlife? 80% of them like wildlife. Do you see wildlife important in their future? 70 or 80% see wildlife in their future. So we have Africans seeing wildlife as their future livelihoods, somehow being denigrated as being unethical by Western people consuming the planet. And I mean, if you talk about ethical dilemmas and ethical arrogance, there's so many ways of looking at it. Killing an animal, everyone's killing animals. Every time you, every time you drink a bottle of wine, you're killing animals. You're killing. If you drink a bottle of Cabernet from Cape Town, you've cleared 2 hectares or two square meters of very rare fynbos vegetation. Every time you step out and have a coffee, you've cleared rainforest. So let's not talk about ethics from people who are consuming half the planet and are incredibly disconnected from the way the world works. You can see I was talking about Africans. The Africans, their capacity is enormous now. They really are getting angry with being told what to do by rich Westerners sitting far away. I think you've interviewed some of them. And they will rise up and they will say this is BS. We can't have that. And things like CITES, we think we have the right to use our animals as we want. So economically, we would be stupid to pull out of CITES because then the Americans will ban our hunting and wildlife won't be worth it. And we will shift from a wildlife economy back into a livestock economy. But think of it another level. These people have been dominated through colonialism. There's a deep history of colonialism here, and you've got white people from far away telling black people what to do. It's quite likely that they'll pull out of CITES because of identity. They're just going to say, we're so sick and tired of you white guys telling us what to do. To hell with the wildlife, to hell with the economy. We're just angry. We're going to pull out, and we're just going to kill these animals. If you want us to do that, we're just going to kill them. We'll replace them with wildlife, with livestock. And I could see, I mean, honestly, the anger of these people at the demeaning way in which these up-and-coming, talented Africans are being treated is also a serious ethical problem.
I think you've answered my last question, which is, I was going to ask you to get a little bit belligerent.
Oh, yes, I'm belligerent because
No,
it's so
you
unfair.
moved, you did it in a very calm but forceful way. And I was going to say, so, what's the worst case scenario? Say they do ban. Say, do you have any predictions? Would we move east and say, screw you? I don't know if you've covered everything.
Yeah, so I can talk. I'll finish off maybe with that if that's what you want. So the best case scenario is if we can. We're not perfect here. We've got problems and we've done analysis and we can see where we can improve. And in some places we're earning $1 per hectare from wildlife. We could earn 20. We have our own issues. We need to sort our own legislation. We need to give more power to communities. If we did that, our wildlife economy would be massive. If we could put ivory and rhino horn back into the market, it would be double massive. If we got more tourists coming and we've got African people coming into the marketplace, it would be triple massive. So we could have a massive wildlife economy. And then I think you'd see Southern Africa and East Africa being a major wildlife economy. The alternative scenario is that if we keep going to CITES and we keep having our wildlife banned, the wildlife is going to be less than the cattle, and Africans are going to be so pissed off that we're just going to turn Africa back into an overgrazed cattle and goat farm. So we have a choice. We can have this massive intact habitat. 50% of Southern Africa is just like it used to be 300 years ago, or we can have a goat farm. Let's choose that. We know how to do this. The conservationists are making us do the goat farm, which is the pinnacle of unintended consequences and external arrogance. And we're going to fight for this, and I freaking hope we win. But at the same time, the irony is we're fighting our own brothers. We all want to conserve wildlife, and for some reason they're thinking of this narrow thing that if you shoot an animal, it destroys everything, and if you trade an animal, it destroys anything. They've caught in an ideology that is incoherent, and that incoherence is destroying wildlife on the planet. And some of the biggest causes of the destruction of wildlife on the planet is conservation policy, driven by educated conservationists and high officers.
Can we quickly touch on CBNRM? Because I think it's kind of a counter that in a way is pushing to solve a lot of the things you say we can improve on.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, from $1 to people's getting.
Yeah.
Do I need to say more? But
No, I
maybe
can
just if
kick
you
off
can
that.
say the community-based natural resource management program, or CBNRM, is expanding, and what is it? And very briefly, do you think that will help balance people's perception of hunting specifically, and how does CBNRM? Is my question clear?
Yeah, no, I got it. So, community-based natural resource management effectively is a program to enable people to go back to a livelihood based on wildlife. And essentially, what we do is we give the rights, well, we don't. The rights go back to the people who live with the wildlife. The, hundreds of thousands of villages in Africa are living in places where agriculture, they're depending on agriculture, but it doesn't really work. They could be much better off with wildlife, and because of colonial constraints and decapitalization of the wildlife sector and all that sort of thing, their wildlife is only earning about $1 per hectare. They could easily go up to $20, and that would uplift hundreds of thousands of villages. More than that, these communities have been, they're basically marginalized communities with very low social capital. These are the people that were destroyed by the slave trade. These were the people, that's 400-year history, destroyed by colonialism. These are the people that are being exploited through lack of property rights. These are the people that sometimes external NGOs are even oppressing to conserve wildlife. You hear about what green
Greenpeace.
militarization of conservation. So these are the people that are suffering from conservation and development. Yet they're the people who love wildlife. They love wildlife. As I said, 70-80% see wildlife in the future. What we're doing is we're using wildlife to democratize these communities. So our ideal is that they hunt wildlife, because most of them, they're too far and not in the right place for tourism. So you get $20,000 from an elephant and $10,000 from a lion, and you put it in the middle of a table, and the community sits around and they talk about what to do with their wildlife. Through the process of discussing that using Eleanor Ostrom Nobel Prize winning kind of principles, we're basically rebuilding the fabric of African society that's been destroyed by external forces for the function of extracting resources from them. So we're basically giving or helping them rebuild their power so they can stop everybody taking resources away from them and they can manage their resources successfully. If we're successful, many villages in Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, Mozambique, etc., will get 20, 30, 40, 50% of their income by going back to nature, by rewilding. Of course, we have to do agriculture, and we have to do it a lot more carefully. But that's essentially what CBRM is about. Now, to make CBRM work, you have to challenge a lot of misconceptions about conservation. Misconception one is that farming is better than wildlife. It's not. Misconception two is that commoditizing wildlife is a bad thing. It's not. Misconception three is that poor black people are incompetent. Well, they're not. So if we can break those three misconceptions, I think we're going to find, and we've seen even this week working in these communities, that these rural black communities are the strongest conservation force in the planet. Because I think you probably saw, they really like wildlife. They're fighting for wildlife. They're taking the government to court because they want the benefits from wildlife because they want to manage it. They're moving their houses to make way for wildlife. No Westerner is moving his mansion to make way for bears, to the reintroduction of bears in England or wolves in Switzerland or Idaho. African people in more than one place are actually saying, we need wildlife. Let's move our houses here so we can make more space. That's a freaking commitment, and we need to support them to do that. If we do that, we're going to have healthier communities and healthier environment, and that's going to help us cope with climate change.
And I think the thing for me is the astounding, resounding is wildlife gives us really quality jobs. It gives bursaries to kids to go study some of, just like we say in London, go and be a lawyer, a doctor, an architect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those are the jobs you're going to go into because that's the economy. So what's happening, everybody's telling me this, is wow, we're getting this income, particularly from hunting, but the community-based natural resource management program, which is all resources, all natural resources. And it's actually uplifting, really, in terms of the quality of life, the quantity, what's available to people. And that's why I think this passion and this love, you know what I mean? I'll
Yeah, yeah.
defend this stuff
Yeah,
as
yeah.
much as I'll defend my cattle and my kids and
Absolutely.
my property. I don't know if you've already said that, but I was just really thinking about you bringing up this cadre of young people with real quality jobs, quality life, but in a very rural setting. And it's almost the arrowhead for all development which is happening in rural areas because the government simply doesn't have enough funds, enough manpower, lady power to cater for all the development needs. I don't know if you know what I mean. So there's
Yeah,
this interesting diversification, this devolution, it's really quite powerful and palpable to me.
Yeah, it's very powerful. So I'll explain it from the negative
Yeah.
to the positive. So we've been doing these surveys, looking, do you like wildlife? How much money do you make? Do you have food? Are you hungry? And one of the things we're putting in is, do they have social capital? So we know that the success of society is usually dependent on the social capital in the society. And we're finding relatively low levels because of colonialism, slavery, etc. Our counterfactual is actually West Africa, where social capital, we haven't measured there, but I know it's low. And as a consequence of that, these communities have collapsed economically, environmentally, because of climate change. And you have violence, and that leads to massive migration into Europe and America, and it's destabilizing the world. So the negative story is that if we don't do something, we're going to destabilize the world. The positive story is, as you've probably seen here, by giving people back their wildlife, you're giving them discretion over their own lives. You're giving them economic power they've never had. And you have to put in systems so that the elites don't take all the money.
Yeah, we're done. So
I just finished.
sorry about that.
So as I said, in West Africa, you've got an environmental collapse and social collapse. We've had hints that that could happen in Southern Africa. But what we're doing with wildlife is we're giving people ownership of a resource and we're giving them discretionary capital. Provided we put in systems that is governed properly, so we don't get another 1,000 years of elite capture, which is what these people are suffering in. Well, that's what we do. We're building little democracies. We're re-empowering people so that they have their own money, so they can sit at the table and say, do we want a school or a clinic? Do we want to feed ourselves? Or do we want to have scholarships? And as you were saying, some of these scholarships, these people are going to secondary school and then they're going to university. And in some of the communities, for example, I work in Zimbabwe, you say, what's the biggest thing in Campfire? Well, we have 3 doctors in London and we've got a physicist in New York. And so in some ways, the fact that they've got discretion is enabling some of them to climb out of poverty and go elsewhere as professionals. But at the home, it's giving them... Some of our surveys, you're seeing the touch of helplessness and hopelessness. Those are people when a terrorist comes in and gives you an AK-47, you pick it up and you go with them. So when you have a sense of helplessness, you're extremely vulnerable to violence. What we're doing is giving people meaning in their lives. So we own our wildlife, we manage our wildlife, we're game guards, we've got some money, we can build a clinic, we can have cash. And so you almost, in many ways, we are rebuilding. Our biggest aim is to rebuild pride in societies and rebuild the structures so people are respected by themselves and respected by others. And that, I think that'll stop a global disaster. So it's not even primarily about wildlife. You could say it's about reacting to climate change and stopping 100 million people going to Europe. I'm really not joking on that. Because if we take all their rights away and say, you guys can't have wildlife, etc., what are these guys going to do? Well, they're going to get in boats, aren't they, eventually? Or they're going to pick up AK-47s. I think that's probably enough, eh?
Yeah.
Unless you got more questions.